Hello everyone, Wayne Motts, the President Emeritus and Historian from the Gettysburg Foundation, with my friend, co-author, historian extraordinaire, Mr. Jim Hessler, out for round two, Pickett's Charge round two. If you haven't seen round one, go to the YouTube channel and look at it for Pickett's advance. Today we're going to do the northern wing, and Jim, of course, I can't thank you enough for coming out here. Jim is involved as the co-host for the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. I think many of our viewers are probably tuned into there. If you're not, they should be over there. And he's also involved in touring and everything else, so we just thank him for coming out. Of course, he and I co-author of a work here on Pickett's Charge, and we're just grateful to be out here for the Gettysburg Foundation. And Jim, we want to thank you for coming out.
And I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thanks as always for the invite, and I can't wait to get started with video number two.
And we just want to tell everybody on behalf of our park partners, you know, Jim and I, we've been walking this battlefield for many years. So we're out here today. We're going to walk along a mowed path. If you do this yourself, just be mindful of the park resources here, and also pick the time of the year. We're still out here pretty early in the season for us, but as it gets later, it's going to get more difficult. So doing this in the shoulder season is always a preferred time to be able to, I think, to be able to do that.
And much warmer than when we did video.
Yes, when we did number one, it was pretty cold.
It was pretty cold.
So for volume two, for Pickett's Charge 2, we're going to do Pettigrew and Trimble's advance for July 3rd, 1863. And we're not going to focus very much on the Union defense. We're going to save that for Pickett's Charge Volume 3. And folks, we're calling this Pickett's Charge. Once again, we're not trying to put down any of the troops that are over here on the northern wing of the assault. So if you're an Alabaman or Tennessean or Mississippian, we're not trying to insult you. But what we're trying to do is, if you can't beat them, join them, right? We want people to understand exactly what this is. It's the northern wing for July 3rd, 1863. Jim, why don't you did such a great job on that setup, and we're not going to do a whole, if you go over to volume one, if you want the whole setup for Pickett's Charge. But what about where we're at? We can talk a little bit about the troops involved for July 3rd.
Sure.
Kind of orient the viewers.
Okay, happy to do so. Well, hello again, everybody. We are standing over my left shoulder, kind of behind the camera, and to the right would be the North Carolina State Monument, just to give you sort of a general orientation. I'm sure many of you know where we're at. I'm not going to go again into the detail of July 1st and July 2nd in terms of what brings the fighting out here. By July 3rd, suffice to say, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is basically positioned where we are, along Seminary Ridge, and of course, as you all know, George Meade's Army of the Potomac is situated behind us on Cemetery Ridge, a little bit less than a mile away. Abby, if you can pan the camera over in that direction, we'll give folks a general sense of what we're looking at, and specifically the target and the objectives for the part of the attack we're doing today, the Pettigrew Trimble Charge. Right. By July 3rd, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia are not feeling defeated. They have scored success on July 1st, partial success on July 2nd. So by the late morning, early afternoon of July 3rd, Lee has generally decided that he is going to launch an assault against what they generally refer to as the left center of the Union position. They don't get a whole lot more specific than that, and that's opened up some conversation and debate among historians over what the objective of the attack should be. We think, based on the words of some of the participants, and which we'll see today in this video, the troop deployments, we think the objective of the attack is primarily right behind where Wayne and I are standing right now. So if you get a good look kind of over to where I'm pointing right now, you see all of the heavy trees that today kind of litter the Colt Park area and would run up to the western slope of Cemetery Hill. July of 1863, that was primarily open. By July 3rd, heavy Union artillery up on Cemetery Hill. You are not going to launch a direct assault against high ground loaded with artillery. Am I right, Wayne?
Right, that's right.
So what we think, and look, people get too hung up on trees. Ziegler's Grove versus the copse of trees. Forget about trees. Trees might be a target for troops on the move, but they are not an objective in the attack. What we think the objective in the attack is the front of Cemetery Ridge, which is directly in front of me right now, roughly running from the White Abraham Bryan barn, which is where we are going to end the tour today, and then running up Cemetery Ridge, past the high watermark area, past the copse of trees, and give or take to about where you can see the obelisk of the U.S. regular monument on the ridge. That is about a mile wide front. Armstead Long, Lee's military secretary, said that was established as the objective because that was where the slope of Cemetery Ridge kind of runs into the Emmitsburg Road, and by putting pressure on that point, they thought they could break the Union line at that position and then possibly turn towards Cemetery Hill. That is, in our opinion, the objective and the target of the attack. And we do think Pickett's charge hit what they were aiming at. We don't think they were misdirected from Ziegler's Grove and all this other stuff. A lot of theories out there about
and Jim, let's also say as part of that the final objective, the operational objective for the assault probably is Cemetery Hill, because they're going to strike the federal line, break that line, and then turn north.
Turn towards Cemetery.
And Armstead Long mentions that,
which is what Long says.
You're talking about.
Now, Wayne, skeptics out there could be saying, well, you know, Long is Lee's military secretary. He wrote that many years after. But here's the thing, people. What he says is consistent with what they do on the field. It is consistent with the dress of the attack, which they talk about. And it is consistent with how Longstreet, who is still managing this attack, will deploy the troops, including the deployment of Pettigrew and Trimble's division, half division, which we're going to talk about today. So it's consistent with what happens on the field.
And I don't know of a case after the war when Armstead Long released that, which was after the war, that anybody said he wasn't right. I mean, the people that were still living didn't dispute that, what was actually there. So I think the evidence on this is pretty clear. Jim, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but
that's
anyway.
good. So now let's talk a little bit about Johnston Pettigrew.
Yes.
Isaac Trimble.
Yes.
Who are going to be the focal points of today's tour. Now, even though they are in AP Hill's 3rd Corps, as I said, Longstreet is managing the entire attack, and that will include the 3rd Corps troops that are engaged today. Now, both of those divisions had been seen heavy action on July 1st and had been shot up pretty good. In the front line, you were going to have Henry Heath's division. Heath has been wounded on July 1st. They have to turn over his division on July 3rd to one of his brigade commanders, the highly regarded Johnston Pettigrew. All right, we're going to have 4 brigades in the front line. We're going to have Brockenbrough's brigade over on the extreme Confederate left.
Maybe you want to pan over this way, Abby, and we'll get word as you can see the seminary church steeple off in the background here, so you get an idea where we're actually at. So go ahead, Jim. I'm sorry.
Pettigrew's left would be the well in front of that steeple, kind of over around where the David McMillan House and the McMillan Campground is today. Brockenbrough is a weak brigade on the left. We're going to talk about them today. You're going to have Joe Davis's brigade next to them.
We can swing. Maybe we just come around. Go ahead, Jim.
Davis's brigade heavily engaged in the railroad cut on July 1st. Here, around the North Carolina monument, is going to be the biggest brigade in Heath's division. That would normally be Johnston Pettigrew's brigade because he's commanding the division today. Another young man, Colonel James Marshall, is going to be elevated to command of this brigade. So right about North Carolina would be where that brigade is going to step off. And last but not least, in the front line, as you'll pan towards the Tennessee monument and beyond, would be James Archer's brigade. Archer was captured on July 1st, so we have another elevation, Colonel Burkett Fry. Okay, that's your front line. On paper, that would probably be over 7,000 men or so. We think probably, give or take, on July 3rd, maybe 5,000 or so in the ranks.
We've got all these casualties, and let us remember, they're not counting these casualties day by day. So we've got, these units are engaged, all the units that you see here, some less than others, but they're engaged basically on the first day of the battle, so we don't know exactly what that number is.
Robert E. Lee rides along these lines at one point, and he sees guys bandaged up, wounded, walking wounded, bandages around their heads, saying, you know, I wish we didn't have to use them, but this is all we've got, and the attack must succeed. Now, we can argue whether that really was all they had, but for now, that is your front line.
And the choice of who is more damaged than who else. Could argue the choices that were made. And that leads to what I think, Jim, and some others have said too, you and I talked about it, is maybe poor staff. There's some staff work here that the commanding general apparently doesn't know certain things. If you remember, there's a part in Lee's report where he basically says he didn't realize that the ammunition on the artillery was so low, and he said, in fact, it was unknown to me.
We're getting to the end on that.
I'm sorry. But he mentions these things.
But again, let's not let Longstreet off the hook either, right?
Right about that.
Because even though, again, this is 3rd Corps under Hill, they are told report to Longstreet.
He's the operational commander.
The commander of the attack. Okay, back line real quick. So now in the back line, you've got half of Dorsey Pender's division. Now, Pender was mortally wounded on July 2nd, so you get sort of another battlefield promotion here. 61-year-old Isaac Trimble, who had come up into Pennsylvania as a supernumerary, I think probably being a little bit of a thorn in Richard Ewell's side, offering him a lot of unsolicited advice. On the morning of the 3rd, Trimble heard that both Heath and Pender were wounded, so Trimble petitions Lee to come out here and get a command, and they basically give Trimble half of Pender's division, which will be the brigades of James Lane, and normally Alfred Scales. Scales was wounded on July 1st, so we give that to William Lawrence. Now, I want to show you one thing real quick in the alignment, and I wish we had Bob from Endicott here to give me another body. Okay, Wayne is going to be Pettigrew in the front. All right?
Gotcha.
We'll do the dress when we get over there, but this is going to be Pettigrew's line in the front. Pettigrew's line is bigger than Trimble's. Trimble, because of the deployment and because he is smaller, is going to be positioned behind Pettigrew's right and not his left.
And that is important, right?
That is important. Why is that important, Wayne? Tell them.
It's important because if the focus of the attack was north, then they would have shifted the position of Trimble being on the northern half. And so he's more toward the right center of this line, where the dress of the line will be, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So everybody, when you're looking at evidence for where this attack is supposed to go, you got to look at all the evidence.
Come on the field, people. Come on the field.
It's exactly right. That's the reason why we're out here walking this thing today.
Exactly right. So that's, in a nutshell, we did that kind of quick, but that's the deployment for the attack. So we think probably Heath or Pettigrew and Trimble together probably with walking wounded, guys who were injured on July 1st, guys who drop out from heat and straggling and artillery fire and all that other stuff. We think probably about 7,000 or so combined will make the charge on July 3rd between Pettigrew and Trimble combined. That's an estimate. Nobody knows the exact number. We've seen numbers a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but let's say 7,000 guys out here. Bigger, we should add, than George Pickett's division, who, Pickett gets all the attention and the glories.
And of course, not making the charge, we also have the artillerist, and we'll talk a little bit about that artillery line, but I think you and I, when we did our work, we talked basically 12,500 men. That's the number of total people that we're talking about, with a break in this line between where Pickett's division lines up, south, see volume 1 for that, and over here now that Jim has just described, everything over here for part 2 on the northern side. They will be in the edge of the tree line here, as well as back behind where the slope is. We're out in the open here, so you can see this is where they'd be taking their steps to step off, but it's a crowded day today, so as Abby is filming, you'll see a lot of people out here on the battlefield where most of the people go.
And so before I wrap up and turn it back over, just then one summary comment on command, if I could.
Absolutely.
So if you're following along, I just want you to get a sense of basically all of the de facto battlefield promotions that have happened here at the command level. So let's keep count. Pettigrew for Heath, that's 1. Trimble for Pender, that's 2. Brockenbrough and Davis are with their normal brigades, but you know what, folks? We don't really like those guys that much anyways. Marshall for Pettigrew, that's 3. Fry for Archer, that's 4. And then Lawrence for Scales, that's 5.
And that's at the senior level. We're talking for the brigades involved here. So we've got 3 brigades in Pickett's division. All 3 of those commanders were intact. They're not used on July 1st or 2nd, so they're still in command. Now you got all these command changes changes. And people, who's going to know who Trimble is when he comes over here?
He says total strangers to me. I didn't know these guys.
Right, exactly. And that's going to weigh into some of the structure. And believe me, when Pickett's charge is over, unfortunately for the Union, unfortunately for the Confederates, more fortunately for the Union, there's going to be a lot of changes here because they're going to lose a lot of troops. This is a big challenge for Lee. It's not just replacing the manpower, it's the organization of these troops. It's all of that. It's all going to be important for this fight over here on July 3rd, Jim.
All right, well, I'll turn it back over to you. That's our introduction, folks.
Yeah, and I just want to make a couple comments that are here, and I really appreciate that, Jim, because I think you laid it out pretty well. We're talking about elements of two Confederate divisions here, now under the command of Isaac Trimble, and of course, James Johnson Pettigrew. We're now looking at two commands here, which is going to have to cut, right? You're going to have to cut that out. We're now looking at two commands here, of course, which is certainly James Johnson Pettigrew, who's in charge of the division. Isaac Trimble is behind that. Pickett's division. We should mention, as we did, I think, in Volume 1, there's 4 divisions that are actually part of this. So you've got 2 brigades that are on the right. These are brigades in Richard Heron Anderson's division that are going to be on the right supporting this line.
Could that be video part 4?
Yeah. Oh, maybe so.
Maybe.
Right.
Abby,
hey, I never even thought about
4?
that. That's a good.
Abby's excited. Yeah.
That's a good idea. I never even thought about that. Yeah, maybe we'll do video part 4 on the 4th division, the unknown Pickett's Charge division, which nobody knows about here on July 3rd, 1863. I just want to mention a little bit about. We talked earlier about the setup for Pickett's Charge. You got to go to Volume 1 to see most of that. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that at this half of the attack, they're going to talk about the dress of the attack. We'll mention that a little bit further. But there really isn't communication. People are not sitting down here together. There's a scene in Gettysburg, the movie, if we want to mention that, and I know we're way outside that, but there's a scene that's inside the movie that actually shows Tom Berenger drawing on the ground, and he's meeting with James Johnson Pettigrew. He's meeting with the actor that plays Isaac Trimble, and he's saying, this is how this is all going to go down. He actually reverses the divisions, by the way, when he makes the drawing on the ground. But it's interesting because that scene in the movie, that didn't happen. And if it had happened, there might have been some better coordination in a lot of this. Now, I guess that would, as you mentioned, Jim, ultimately fall on James Longstreet because he's the operational commander here. So probably 2/3, not quite 2/3 of this attack is going to be Hill's men, but it's still under the operational control of James Longstreet, and you got to deal with that.
And if I could add, because I didn't mention, yes, folks, A.P. Hill is at Gettysburg. He does file a report, and if you're wondering what Hill is doing, with a lot of his brigades being told to report to Longstreet, Hill says in his report, which Lee then basically seconds and confirms, Hill says, I was told to hold the line with the rest of my command and avail myself of any opportunity that might be gained. So when we get to the end, let's see if that opportunity and that availment that Hill talks about actually happens. But Hill is not MIA. He's still on the field, and according to his report and Lee's report, that is what Hill is doing.
And stay tuned for that opportunity to cooperate, so to speak, because that's also instructions given to Robert Rhodes in Ewell's Corps. We're going to talk a little bit about it. What are these folks supposed to be doing? What are they supposed to be doing over here? So there's some coordination. We know that some of this happened, but we don't have a lot of it down in writing because it seems to have been verbal. And a lot of this seems to have been verbal. And that's going to be an issue. So on the morning of July 3rd, these troops are going to get in position. They're over here. Some of them have been here, of course, on July 2nd as well. Here, and then on July 3rd, they're going to be lined up along this tree line, along what is now Seminary Ridge that Jim has pointed out when we do it. There will be the cannonade, which will precede Pickett's charge, and we know that the de facto commander of this cannonade, at least in Longstreet's corps, is going to be E. Porter Alexander. E. Porter Alexander, the colonel in charge of that, but that's going to be basically for Longstreet's artillery. For A.P. Hill's artillery, which is where we're standing, it's going to be Reuben Lindsay Walker. He's going to be the head of the 3rd Corps artillery here. And Walker's men along with Ewell's artillery. So we've got 3 corps of artillery going to be working here. And William Melson Pendleton mentions a little bit about it, but there's not a lot of coordination. So there's over 60-some guns. There's probably, I think we talked about how many were over on Longstreet side. I think 60-some guns over there, maybe 70-some. We've got 150 total guns over here for the cannonade. And Walker will have a significant portion of that, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of coordination as far as what that artillery is supposed to do.
And nobody ever talks about Walker's guns because he doesn't write about it afterwards the way Alexander does.
Right. The cannonade will begin about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And remember, as we talked about in video 2, just to recap, it's supposed to accomplish destroying Union troops, destroying morale over there, taking out artillery pieces over there. So when these troops march across here, you don't have that hard Union defense. That will not be successful for Lee, and he talks about that on 2 different occasions. But that doesn't mean there isn't damage over here for July 3rd. Some of these units are pretty bashed up from this artillery, especially the ones that are right over the slope of this hill, because that's where the artillery overshots are going that are here. Now, Jim, what we want to do, I'd like to move from here, if we can, and move us back a little bit, and we're going to talk about one cannonade fatality here. One of my favorite stories, Jeremiah Gage of the 11th Mississippi. I'd love to move back to that and talk about. Is there anything else you'd like to add here before we get on?
No, let's start Walking Wednesday. Let's do it.
All right, let's go.
All right.
We just moved, Jim, just a little bit off of this ridge, so we're on the west side now of Seminary Ridge, and we're right next to the 11th Mississippi Memorial, which is a unit that is in Joe Davis's brigade of Heath's division of what is now the command that's in the front. So this would be under Pettigrew, but Joe Davis still in command here. It was in command on July 1 and in command on July 3.
They'd be a little bit further over that way.
Yeah, a little bit to the north of where we're at, but the memorial today is pretty interesting. It depicts William O'Brien, who's the color bearer of one of the companies of the 11th Mississippi. This is one regiment of Joe Davis's brigade that's not actively involved in the fighting on July 1st. They're actually held in reserve. So when they get out here on July 3rd, they're a fresh regiment of Davis's brigade, which fought at the railroad cut on the first day, and they weren't there. So they're bringing basically their full strength. The monument says right on it 393 men, and it lists all their casualties, tremendous casualties for this unit during the time of the battle. But one of the first casualties they suffer here on July 3rd is actually when the cannonade begins at 1 p.m. on July 3rd, 1863. And that casualty is a man that was in a company called the University Grays. The University Grays was Company A of the 11th Mississippi Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and these were young men that were at Mississippi in the university, and they all closed down and basically went into service. So if you're at the university at Mississippi, you're going to go into the service from Ole Miss into the service here. And Jeremiah Gage is the man that we're going to talk about here. And I got a couple notes on Gage because he's one of my favorite stories here in the Battle of Gettysburg. So he's born March 9, 1840. That makes him 23 years old here in the battle in Holmes County, Mississippi. Richland is the town, the area, the village where he's from. He was second of 12 total children to a planter, Matthew Gage, second of 12 children born to Matthew Gage. And Jer was just short, that's what they called him, of his 20th birthday when his father died. Now, the 1860 census, I want everybody to think about this, his personal estate of Gage's father was over $28,000. This is like almost $1 million today. If we calculated what the money was, the real estate was at $15,000, and in the 1860 census, the family owned 13 slaves. Obviously, enslaved persons is what's going to make up most of this. Jeremiah Gage got a better than average education, obviously based on his family's status, and at age 8 he'll be enrolled in a private academy, which is the Richland Literary Institute. He'll study Greek, Latin, math, history, and geography. And by 10 he could translate. By 10 years of age, Jeremiah Gage of this unit in the Battle of Gettysburg could translate Caesar's commentaries from Latin into English.
Well, I bet that came in handy.
Imagine that. Oh. He entered the University of Mississippi in 1856 at age 16, and he graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1860, and he was near the top of his class. So when he graduated, he wanted to be a lawyer, so he basically enrolled in the law school there, and then the Civil War breaks out. So he enlisted in the Civil War in April of 1861 in Company A of the 11th Mississippi, and he's promoted from corporal to sergeant, Jim, and he's wounded in action at the Battle of Gaines Mill. Badly wounded in the hip that's there. Well, on July 3rd, he's standing over here and he gets hit with this, basically with an artillery shell, and he's taken to an aid station that's pretty nearby. Now he knows that his case is a mortal case. When the doctor looks at him, the doctor sort of brushes this off, and he says, "Oh, that's not that bad." But then Gage apparently raises up a garment that's covering him and said, "No, this is where I'm really hit." And a shell tore away most of his side. It was just a devastating wound. And then the doctor realizes, look, this man he's not gonna make it. So the doctor then asks Gage if there's anything he can do for him, and Gage basically writes a letter to his mother before he dies, and that letter is preserved, and today it's like in the Old Miss archives. It still exists today, and this is what he wrote. "My dear mother, this is the last you may ever hear from me. I have time to tell you that I died like a man. Bear my loss as best you can. Remember that I am true to my country, and my greatest regret at dying is that she is not free, and that you and my sisters are robbed of my worth, whatever that may be. I hope this will reach you, and you must not regret that my body cannot be obtained. It is a mere matter of form anyhow. This is for my sisters too. I cannot write more. Send my dying release to Miss Mary." That would be a girlfriend. Actually, we think that they were engaged. Looks like they were actually engaged. "You know who. J.S. Gage, Company A, 11th Mississippi, Richland, Holmes County, Virginia." And then he put a note on it, still exists in the original letter, "Stained in my own blood," stained in his own blood, basically, is what it says. So Gage passes away here at Gettysburg. He dies from this wound that he suffered in the cannonade, one of the first casualties of the 11th Mississippi Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and they haven't even stepped off yet in Pickett's charge. So those artillery overshots are coming over the artillery line that's along this stone wall and landing back here into these troops, and including Trimble's men, which are a little further down.
Which I thought might be a good idea if maybe, Abby, you just want to pan the camera in that direction to the reverse slope of Seminary Ridge, because so often people don't come back here and take a look. But Pettigrew and Trimble both say before stepping off, they were back here behind the batteries. So
now we got bus traffic here.
Yeah, I know. We always talk about Confederate overshots of the artillery, but yes, folks, the Union guns overshot too, and this is where they would go and create casualties before stepping off.
So we understand the cannonade didn't accomplish Lee's goals. That doesn't mean it didn't cause damage. And you just heard of one of the casualties. Now we want to move here, Jim. We're going to go over and pick up Tennessee for our actually walk. So let's move over to the Tennessee Memorial. And we're south of North Carolina for the Tennessee Memorial that was here, put up in 1982 and dedicated. One of the newer monuments on the battlefield, sort of like the Mississippi Monument being relatively new. But
the 80s, that was only 10 years, 15 years ago.
Yeah, right. That's how I feel. Yeah.
That's how I feel too.
Yeah, that's right. So now we're over here, and once again, Jim had mentioned the front line. Obviously, the Tennesseans for Archer and under the command of Burkett Fry. Now, the brigade's probably going to be a little further south of this location. But Jim, the dress of who's going to focus on the movement of these troops, and that also gives us a hint as to where the target is. Why don't you talk a little bit about the dress of this assault? And the Tennesseans are going to be integral in that.
And the Alabamians. Don't want to forget them too, folks. So when we say dress of the attack, basically what we mean is the direction. And so as Wayne said, the North Carolina Monument is just over here. As I said in the introduction, Pettigrew Marshall's Brigade is a big brigade, so they probably still extended to our immediate front. And as Wayne said, Archer's Brigade, which is under Burkett Fry today, would probably be a little bit more over in that direction. Fry's brigade, Alabamians and Tennessee's, is a small brigade. They're only about 800 guys. And so on July 3rd, they are temporarily commanded by one of the regimental commanders, 41-year-old Colonel Burkett Fry. Now, Fry was kind of an interesting guy.
He sure is.
He was a Virginian by birth, even though he's attached to an Alabama regiment. He was a Virginian by birth. He had failed out of West Point for failing mathematics. Study your math, kids. Stay in school. All right? But he was a lawyer. He went out west prior to the war. He was a 49er, you know, immigrant out west, not the football type of 49er, but he had done that. And he had married a woman whose family had business interests in Alabama, and that was how he got connected to Alabama troops. He was leading the 13th Alabama Regiment, wounded 3 times prior to Gettysburg. That's a brave guy, folks, 3 times prior to Gettysburg. Okay, so the dress, the division of the direction of the attack. Pettigrew, at one point in the morning here, tells Fry to go over and see General Pickett and decide how we are going to dress this attack. Fry says he takes a ride over there. He finds Pickett. He says Pickett is in very high spirits, thinking this is going to be a successful attack. And during their conversation, General Garnett, who is basically Pickett's left, comes over and joins them. So you following us? We've got Fry on Pettigrew's right, Garnett on Pickett's left, and now we're going to figure out how these 2 guys connect with each other. They decide in their conversation that Garnett is going to dress on Fry. Wayne, should we come over here a little bit and just show them what that would look like then?
Yeah. So I'm okay.
So you're Garnett and Pickett's division.
There's
Fry.
a gap in between.
Yep, there's a little bit of a gap. I am Fry in Pettigrew's division, and when we advance, basically Fry is going to go straight forward towards the area of the angle.
Right.
All right, he's going to go, he's not going over to Ziegler's Grove. The direction of the attack is going in the area of the angle.
Right.
And Garnett is going to dress on them,
And that means, and dress, is, we should say, is a fancy word for movement. The direction that they're gonna follow. The predetermined scheme of maneuver for the assault.
And folks, watch as Jim and Wayne walk straight. Ready?
And then I'm going this way.
Yep. And then he's coming over onto me. Now there is going to be a little bit of confusion, as often happens. And some of Pettigrew's guys are going to kind of crowd over in this direction. So you're going to have a little bit of crowding, but they are going straight in that direction. That is the dress of the attack. Pickett's charge, the Pettigrew-Trimble charge, lands where it was aimed, not misdirected from somewhere else.
Yeah. If you're over here at this side of the line, and you're right behind the stone wall, Abby, let's just move over here, because the artillery is up against the stone wall for Reuben Lindsay Walker's 3rd Corps artillery, most of it. Unlike Pickett's, which is advance of where Pickett's line is, most of this artillery is a stone wall. So Pettigrew's division, which is Heath's, is right behind or just west of where the wall is, and Trimble then is a little further to the west. So you can actually see, unlike most of the men in Pickett's command, you can look across here. So let's swing back around, and so Abby can see it. You'll see General Meade sitting on his horse up in the distance, way off in the distance. You'll see a bus up on Cemetery Ridge. You'll see a car going through along Emmitsburg Road, and as Jim, you mentioned, the monument to the United States Regulars looks like the Washington Monument poking up down there. So that would be roughly down by our right to the Union left, up to the barn, which is white, that's up in the distance. That's the Abraham Bryan barn, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But as we look across here, these soldiers could see through here. That's different than what most of Pickett's men could see, because they're not seeing anything. We saw that when we did video number 1. You'll see where we're down in those undulations of the ground. When we walk this, the ground is different. Every approach you walk for Pickett's charge, the ground is different. So depending on whether you're at the southern or northern half, you're going to see a little bit better. One of the sergeants of the 14th Tennessee, he was in Company A of the 14th Tennessee, his name was June Kimball, and he reportedly looked across here and said, June Kimball, are you going to do your duty today? Because he knows this is going to be a pretty frightful attack here on July 3rd, and then apparently he reaffirms himself. This is what he writes after the war. You know, this is long after the war. He dies in 1911. He actually survives this assault here on July 3rd. But there's got to be some people that are looking across here thinking, wow, that's not going to be an easy time. You hope this cannonade neutralized some of the Union defense, and unfortunately for the Confederates, it doesn't. Fortunately for the Union Army, every overstrike that this artillery is striking back behind this line, they're hitting a bonus. They're hitting troops that are back behind the line that you mentioned, like Gage, like Jeremiah Gage that we just mentioned.
And we mentioned in video number 1, check your hindsight at the door.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you, me, or anybody else thinks this attack could could work or should have worked.
Right.
Confederate High Command thinks it can work. And again, artillery being a critical part of that.
Right. So the cannonade sort of peters out. The movement to go forward is given. Obviously, Longstreet is the operational commander to do that, and then the troops are going to step off of this ridge and move forward. And I would say that Trimble's line is probably, what, a football field and a half, maybe 150, 100 behind where all this line is.
And again, behind Pettigrew's right, not the left.
Yeah.
That's important, behind the right.
Yeah, and we're going to make sure we cut in some maps too, Jim, when we do some editing on this to make sure that everybody knows where we're at, what we're walking through.
People love maps.
Yeah,
Gotta have good maps.
so they can see. So I think, you got anything else you want to hear? I think we should get walking here. Okay. We're going to walk down the pathway, and we're going to be, we'll end up where the 11th Mississippi ended up. We'll basically end up over on the left of where this attack is. But I'd say we're going to be, at the right center over here. We're not clear on the right of where Pettigrew's men are, but we're close to it, as you mentioned.
And everybody always does Pickett kind of ordering his guys forward. Can we do a little Pettigrew here?
Yeah.
Because according to Fry, when it was time to step off, Pettigrew rode in front of Marshall's brigade, which would be Pettigrew's normal command. You always go with the people you're comfortable with.
Right.
And called out, for the honor of the good old North State, forward.
North Carolinians, there you go.
There you go, right? North Carolina, a proud but prickly bunch sometimes.
Yeah, so we're going to go forward. And so Pettigrew sets this off, and he's mounted. And Jim, we should say some of these men, do we have it? I don't know. I forget, or maybe I don't remember the number count of the men mounted on this end of the attack. We talked Pickett had, more than a dozen, probably 16 or so men mounted over there. I don't know but some of these commanders, Trimble's on a horse, Pettigrew's on a horse. You got some senior people over here also mounted. They got to be to control this.
Marshall is mounted. So again, people think of the movie, all the hoo-ha that is made over Garnett being mounted. There's a lot of guys mounted in the charge.
And once again, it's a command and control issue. This line is very long. Jim just said. Now, we would have had the typical crops growing out here. I guess we should mention that. Wheat, corn, oats, rye, clover grass. We know what some of that is from the claims that were here. And many of the fences taken down, at least the ones closest to the line. But it appears some of the cross fencing still available and up. Caused some movement problems for the troops to actually get through here. I'm amazed at what you can't see. So let's just remember when you move through here that there's points that you're going to be able to see people on the right, and then there's points where you're not going to be able to see people on the right.
And as Pettigrew's order gets passed, they seem to be stepping off right to left. So Fry and Marshall go first, but there's a delay over on our far left with Davis and then especially Brockenbrough stepping off. So it's a little bit right from the beginning, the left is starting to lag. And we'll talk about Brockenbrough's problems at one of the stops. But it's right from the beginning, you've got Davis and Brockenbrough kind of lagging a little bit behind everybody.
It was a partly cloudy day, building up toward rain. It didn't rain during the July 3rd, but it rained after. And we know that the air temperature out here at 2 o'clock on July 3rd is 87 degrees, recorded by Professor Michael Jacobs. One of our colleagues is working on more weather to come. And so we know that the field temperature here is well over 100 degrees, and they're wearing 100% wool uniforms, carrying weapons and equipment going across here. Their backpacks will be thrown down, but they're going to have their cartridge boxes and canteens and all the normal things that they would have, a haversack that they'd be carrying going through where this says. Whoops, watch yourself. Watch out there going through. We just went down in a big hole. That's another thing. If you decide to walk this out here, this is a mowed path, but just be aware, especially if you do it when it's rained, it's going to be wet and there's going to be holes in here, everybody. So just kind of, you don't want to be another casualty, right, Jim, here at Gettysburg?
No, we don't. Don't need any of those.
Kadori Barn off to our front right. So if you take a look at the 3 points that are on that barn was rebuilt in 1882. So that barn would have been smaller during the time of the battle, and we would have just barely been able to see it. We're not under cover here. We're still going to get hit from artillery. So we just came down a little bit, but we didn't go into an undulation that gives us any kind of cover where we're at. Unlike in Pickett's division, where we made that walk, we were getting some cover. Here we're not, and we won't get that until we get a little far ahead of us here.
And that lack of cover extends to our left and our right.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You know, where you see some of the modern houses today would have been what was known as Long Lane during the battle. But again, as we said in the intro, that would have, again, been much more open, less cover than all the houses and trees that you see today.
So the far left of this line for Pettigrew, and this line would be over by where ahead of us, off to our front left. We're at. All right. Notice that everybody's up at the monuments, but they're not doing this walk, Jim. This is
why it's
we get some
Wednesday.
of this. We get some of this to ourselves here for July 3rd, 1863.
Recording this in the spring during peak bus season. But we're out here walking.
Everybody's coming on the walking path. Now this plain that's out off to our front left while we're walking this would have been a farm, which we're going to stop at and talk about, and this is a level area at the time of the battle. So the troops that are going to get up in here, once they come up into this level area, of course, they're going to be open to all this artillery fire. The infantry fire is not going to shoot at them until they get closer to the road.
Well, and that's the thing, you know, when people say General Lee ordered this charge because he didn't understand the weaponry. Yes, he did.
Yeah.
That's why your artillery has to break up the enemy's artillery. Get you across the field before you get into gunfire range.
This is... we can't stress enough that you've got to have all these elements working together. The infantry, the artillery, cavalry, military operations in the Civil War, these combat arms, they all have to work together in order for things to be successful.
Where you see the White House with kind of some red roof lines over there, that's the McMillan House.
Yep.
That would roughly be where Brockenbrough, the left end of this attack, was stepping off from. Batchelder has them in the woods across from McMillan's house. Some people think they're a little bit closer to us where the campground is, but just folks get a general sense in that area. That's where the left was initially stepping off. But as we said, they're lagging behind, and as casualties are mounting from artillery fire, they're going to start to close up pretty quickly. But that at least gives you an idea.
And the viewers may think that's a lot further north than what I think a lot of people would realize. Now, that'll be the start of the attack. Obviously, by the end, it's not that far to the north.
Like that.
But that's pretty, you know, that's pretty far over. And you can see that comes off of the terrain, just like we did, comes back up into this level field.
If you draw a straight line to Steinway Avenue, that'll deposit you somewhere near the old Pickett's Buffet building, which ties into some other stuff.
So all the houses that you see off over here to our front left, they would not have been here during a battle. Skirmish fighting out off to our front left.
How did they march through Colt Park? They didn't. It wasn't here.
It wasn't here, right? Right. That's right. Now, Jim, as we walk through here, you know, some of these areas we're going to go today, including our next stop, these are seldom seen places. This is, unless you're a real battlefield goer, chances are you're not out here walking this kind of thing. So we're going to see some monuments here that no matter how many times you've been to Gettysburg, you may not have looked at these.
Like I said before, I take people out here all the time. They're like, wow, I've come in here for years and I've never stopped at the Bliss Farm.
Right. It's like one of those stops you can always say, well, I've been here this many times, I want to take people to work. All right, Abby's right there with us. Now we're going to come up to this little ridge right here, and we'll make some comments here, but then we're going to go back down again. So we came down one, and now we're up a little ways, and we're going to go back down again. Once again, understanding this is doing this, what we're doing here. Actually doing the walk that we have.
And the second best way to understand it, I'm sorry folks, but would be our Pickett's Charge book, because we have great maps and photos.
Yeah, there is. You can use the maps to try to, sometimes when you don't have maps, it's kind of hard to figure out where you're at.
Yep.
But you're right, Jim, that's a good. proud of that, doing that kind of work. All right, let's get up here to where the memorials are, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Now we should have, let's come up a hair bit, but we want to, maybe we'll do it right here, I guess. Let's swing around. Let's let Abby see where the Virginia Memorial is. So this is the first time we came out beyond the trees to where she can see the Virginia Memorial. So as you're looking at that monument, to the right of that memorial would be the extreme right of Pettigrew's division, which would be Fry's brigade, right along that fence line that's out there. So we started our attack up a little ways where the Tennessee Memorial is. The Tennessean's probably a little further south, right, as Jim mentioned, from what the monument is. That's over here, but this line is pretty extended. So once again, right center probably is where we're at. But you can kind of see where the Virginia Memorial, where the Virginia troops are going to be lined up. Mm-hmm. Right over my shoulder is the North Carolina Memorial. That's where we started our Walking Wednesday tour from here today. We're the North Carolina Memorial, and we've been walking along the path about where the Tennesseans, north of where they would have been during the time of the battle. So we're out at a location called the William Bliss Farm, and this is right in the middle of these two lines. So let's swing around over here. First of all, there's a couple markers out here. The house would have been over here where you're viewing right now, south of where the barn is. Let's swing around over here, Abby, and take a look at the barn that is directly in front of you. That's white. That's the Abraham Bryan barn. You see the Abraham Bryan house. That would be where the left of the charge ends up after Brockenbrough's men withdraw, which Jim is going to mention here in just a few minutes. So let's move back around off over to here. So you see the copse of trees located off in the distance where we're at, the Kadori barn, and then off over here to where the round tops are located. Monument to the 12th New Jersey. We've got units that were here that are here on July 2nd and July 3rd. So the Bliss family that own this property, what do we know about them? They're from Chautauqua, I think, or Chautauqua. How do you say that?
Chautauqua. That's my part of the world, folks.
Chautauqua, New York. So Jim, our New Yorker's helping us out here. That's where William Bliss is from. And Bliss is born in 1799. He's an older man. He will sell property. He will move, come here, and buy the farm that stood here. The barn being over here where this mound is with grass growing on it. The house behind where you're viewing right now. He'll buy the property, and he spends just under $2,000 for it in 1857. So before the Civil War, he is out here, and we don't really have I don't think anybody's ever found a connection with William Bliss and Gettysburg. We don't know why this man from New York decided, I'm going to come out and start a farm here. Unfortunately for him, this is going to be right in the middle of the battle line, not just on July 3 where we're walking, right, but also on July 2nd, 1863, where we're at. So William Bliss and the family, they have to get out of here because the house is right in the middle of this. There's a claim filed after the Battle of Gettysburg for the damages that are here, and unfortunately the Bliss family will never be able to recover from this. They actually sell this place in 1865 for a cost of about $1,000 to Nicholas Kadori, who owns the Kadori farm and the other properties adjacent here, and they ended up paying not quite $2,000 for the property, and they're going to move back to New York. I think they've had enough. There's a claim on this property many years after the Battle of Gettysburg, and they never do get any recompense for any of the damages that's created here. Some of the heaviest skirmishing in the Battle of Gettysburg, yes, is going to be right out at this point where you're at right now. Not just on the third day, but on the second day. So on July 2nd, where we just came from, you're going to have elements of Cornet Posey's Mississippians are going to be the ones that are going to be all along this line, and then you'll have elements of the 14th Connecticut, you'll have elements of the 12th New Jersey. They're all going to come, they're going to come out here. 1st Delaware too, I forget, maybe 1st Delaware. It'll also be out here as well. And so we've got a couple monuments that are out here today, put here in the 1880s, and very few people actually come out and see it. So on the second day, it's going going to be some of these Union troops against Posey's Mississippians. Then on July 3rd, 1863, this is really going to heat up, Jim. So the house is a weatherboard house, 2 stories at the time. But as you mentioned, the barn, this is huge. I mean, there are soldiers inside it shooting out of it. So if you're Alexander Hayes, you want to make sure you neutralize this and get rid of it. And so unfortunately for Farmer Bliss, the place is burned, basically burned down to the ground here for this fighting on July 3rd. So there's a lot of damage that the Blisses won't
research on the Bliss property. Woody always felt that if the Confederates had been able to exert this control over what Woody referred to as this wide hot crimson plain, which I think comes from a quote.
Title of his book.
But Woody always thought if the Confederates could have exerted better control here, not only would it have impacted that July 2nd movement of Posey and Mahone, but it would have given the Confederates easier movement through here on July 3rd, and perhaps would have impacted, the results beyond. So that was always Woody's theory. He placed a lot of importance on this.
Yeah, we also should mention, Jim, that this was the major site of something that happened during the First World War, too, as well. So you want to cover a little bit of that? Because I think it's fascinating. There's a whole bunch of fascinating history out here.
I'd be happy to, because when we did our book, one of the things we inserted was other uses of the battlefield. Camp Cold. The great encampment, the World War II encampment out here. And at the time, some of our friends were kind of like, did you run out of Pickett's charge material? No, we thought that was important. And I think over the ensuing 10 years, I've seen a lot more people coming out here doing World War II stuff and World War I stuff. And I think that's great. We were trendsetters, I like to think in that a little bit. But so interesting stuff out here, other uses of the battlefield. 1918 would maybe be the best known one, Camp Cold, which is probably most folks know was the tank training school, the camp run by Captain Dwight Eisenhower here. Eisenhower was only here for a few months in 1918 before the armistice was declared, but there's some great photos in the park archives, and I hope we'll get one up on screen here, of basically the camp running one of their Renault tanks, and notice how I said Renault correctly? Running one of their Renault tanks over the embankments of the Bliss Farm, right? The camp initially did not have any tanks, right? So you assign a tank training school here with no tanks. But by the summer, they did get maybe as many as 3 tanks out here. Folks, if you got to drive a tank, where are you going to run it? You're going to run it across the fields of Pickett's charge, and that's what they did. And
you got open area to be able to carry that out.
And they trained out here. But there was other stuff. The great encampment for the 1913 reunion, the tent camp out here for the 1944 German POW camp. So there was a lot of multi-uses out here on the battlefield. And you can argue, and we have over the years, whether any of that development also changed the nature of the terrain. Development tends to flatten things, is how I look at it, but a lot of cool uses out here. That, folks, the story goes beyond July 3rd, 1863.
Yeah, and Jim, I want to say before we leave here, we're going to follow, once again, we're on the mode area here, we're going to try to follow the path, but I want everybody to turn around, I want Abby to turn around, look at that increase, look at how it goes up. So you're going to go down into the slope. There's a little run that runs right through here that's just below where we're at. The troops will have to cross that, and as you see, you're going to go right back up again. So the only means of protection you're going to get basically on this side of the line, unlike Pickett's where you're in multiple areas of the undulation of the ground, the only means of protection you're going to get are basically right here, directly here in front of us. So as we leave here and we move forward, we're going to go a little bit different because we're going to follow some of the pathways here, not to go out in this marshy grass, but just note that the troops would have gone right across through here, and the left of this line will end up right behind the barn after Brockenbrough's men are going to have some trouble, and that's going to be what we're going to talk about a little next when we move on here. So let's proceed. We're near where Long Lane is located, and this would have been the Confederate infantry position for July 2nd and July 3rd. In the skirmishing, Robert Rhodes' division, and there's a number of brigades that are in the road. So for Abby to just show you where we're at the corner of Sunset and Long Lane, and Long Lane is fairly close to where we're at. It's a little off of where we're at.
Behind the house.
Behind where the house is located, I think would have been where it would have been during a time of the battle. This is now now, as we mentioned earlier, neighborhood. And we're down in this low piece of ground on the extreme left of where the attack will be after some of the Confederate units have to withdraw here. Before, and Jim, I'm going to let you to talk about that, but let's move around and just show how uphill this is, because now we're down in a hole. We can't really see where we're at. So when you come off of where the Bliss property is, which is right behind where the viewers are, come down into this area here, you're now in a low area of ground where you get some protection. There's not a lot of that at this northern end of where Pickett's charge is located, but right up in front of us, ladies and gentlemen, would be the extreme left, the Bryan property at the time of the battle. Let's turn right back around. Jim, you want to, once again, long lane Confederate soldiers, Rhodes's division, numerous brigades there on the 2nd and on the 3rd day of the battle, skirmishing between Union troops that are up at Cemetery Ridge, coming off of Cemetery Ridge in what is now this neighborhood off to the right of this view. Very contested area, just like the Bliss Farm would have been. And it's one of the reasons why Rhodes, who's ordered to cooperate in this night assault on July 2nd, so while Jubal Early's over there attacking Cemetery Hill, Rhodes, these guys are supposed to be involved in that. But I think it's all this skirmishing. Some of my home state, the Ohioans, are the guys that are doing a lot of that skirmishing. So there's some heavy skirmish activity out here, and the Confederates are in this roadway, which is behind where this house is located, during the time of the battle, and they stay there during the middle of Pickett's charge. So the extreme left, the troops would have to pass through them basically to get up into the area we're at, and this would be the brigade of John M. Brockenbrough. So why don't you talk a little bit about Brockenbrough's men and what they did here on July 3rd? And
yeah,
there's a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We're starting to run short on time, but this is kind of important. So Brockenbrough's brigade, Virginians, ironically, attached to Pettigrew, but Brockenbrough's brigade, you know, long story short, you can look up their history. They're not considered one of the better brigades in the Army of Northern Virginia. Brockenbrough in particular is not really considered a particularly inspiring leader, and they're small. They're short on muskets today. They may have 600 guys in the ranks. They may have as few as 200 guys in the ranks on July 3rd, and so it's kind of ironic that this weak and small brigade is chosen as the critical left of this attack, when you have stronger brigades in long lane, like Thomas, for example, that probably could have been swapped out. So there's a lot of questions about the selection here. Brockenbrough seems to make a decision on this day to basically divide his 4 regiments into what we're going to call 2 demi-brigades today. So there even seems to be some question over why he can't exert control over, you know, what is only 200 to 600 guys. But he seems to split them in half through the left side of the attack. And as I mentioned before, when the attack steps off, Davis's brigade is lagging behind a little bit, but then Brockenbrough's brigade doesn't move. Now the commander of the demi brigade on the right, Colonel Mayo of the 47th Virginia, they can't find him when the cannonade ends to give the order to step forward. So everybody's kind of walking around going, where's Colonel Mayo? Eventually officers make the decision to get moving, and so these regiments on Brockenbrough's left do eventually get moving, but they are lagging behind, and one guy says we literally had to run to catch up to the attack. So from the Union point of view, on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, we see the left side of this attack lagging behind from the beginning. Now, as we said before, and Osborne, the 11th Corps Artillery Chief, talks about Pettigrew having to frequently stop and materially shorten his lines. But as Brockenbrough's guys approach the long lane vicinity, they are basically going in perpendicular to the Union artillery on Cemetery Hill. So for whatever faults they have as a brigade, they've got one of the worst assignments here on the battlefield, and we have to acknowledge that. They're going straight into the teeth of the Union artillery on Cemetery Hill, and Osborne, the 11th Corps Artillery Commander, talks about the frightful effect that the 11th Corps artillery had, breaking up the lines of these troops, which turned out to be Brockenbroughs. So they probably don't get much past the wartime long lane, probably in the literally in the general area where we're standing in right now, when they start to turn back in large numbers. And one of the soldiers says, you know, I feel no shame in recording, we basically turned around and fled. You know, some of the officers, as officers would do, tried to put the best face on it afterwards. But based on the lower casualties, the fact that none of their flags were captured, and the eyewitness accounts of guys, you know, an officer in Trimble's line says we basically had to form bayonets to get Brockenbrough's straggler to go around our regiment. The left of the attack, folks, is falling apart right here in and around the Long Lane area, which is then going to put a lot of pressure on Davis's brigade, who is next in line as we continue to go forward.
And we're going to walk basically the left of Davis. So this would be the 11th Mississippi. We pick back up to where the 11th Mississippi is, behind where you're viewing, to cover that. I also want to make it very clear for the viewers, because we know we're going to get caught on this. Long Lane today is this road right here. This is not the Long Lane. This lane today, which we call Long Lane in Gettysburg, runs east-west. The original lane, which is behind where this house is, called Long Lane, ran north-south.
Ran basically through where the rec park is today.
Exactly.
Behind the houses and through the rec park.
And the Confederate troops are down in that low area. Now, I mentioned Rhodes. You mentioned Thomas's brigade, which is not part of Rhodes, and we know that. So Rhodes is only one group of individuals over here. There's a couple other brigades that are also along Long Lane, many of them, both on the evening of the 2nd and also on July 3rd. But this somewhere right in here is where Brockenbrough's men are going to retire. And if you look at their artillery casualties, Jim, they're minimal, although that fire must have been, they're just not going to stand here and take those casualties. That's what's going to happen, because the fire must have been pretty concentrated, like Osborne said. So they didn't lose a lot of men, but they're not going to stand out here to lose a lot of troops.
Well, that's exactly it. And Osborne says our whole force of artillery was brought to bear upon this column. The havoc produced was truly surprising. So it's havoc. Shells exploding in the ranks, starting to take skirmish fire. And like you say, they don't have to suffer heavy casualties. They just turn back and don't offer any more meaningful participation in the attack. And that's the real story there.
So we're going to leave Brockenbrough's men behind where the house is, near or right where the Long Lane is, right around somewhere right around here. And we're going to walk behind where the view is now, which is to the east, and we'll be on the left of where the Pickett, where the Mississippians would have been.
Okay.
All right, we came up and marched along where the park boundary line is, along the fence line, which would have been the left of Joe Davis's brigade, basically the 11th Mississippi. And we've walked up here with the 8th Ohio Monument in the background behind us, Jim. We've got the barn of Abraham Bryan right here behind us, in the Emmitsburg Road right behind us. When we leave here, we're going to follow the last part of this attack as it goes up here. Let's pan around so we can see. We got traffic up here, but notice we've got the copse of trees and people standing over there where the angle is located, which is where Pickett's division, of course, will break through. See Volume 1 for that. And then you'll see the round tops off in the distance, and we'll swing around and come down over here, and you'll see the Virginia Memorial back off over here to the right of your screen. And then if you go further, I don't know if we can see over this fence line, but you've got where the North Carolina Monument is, where Jim and I, where we started the tour, over by Tennessee. So basically we're walking again the right center, and now we've moved to the left, extreme left, of where Pettigrew's line's going to be, and Trimble's line behind it for the attack on July 3rd. And Jim, why don't you talk about the troops got right up here to where this is. So I don't know, do you want to start with maybe Pettigrew, because Pettigrew goes down?
We sure could. So as we've said throughout, Pettigrew is in front. We've also said throughout his casualties are mounting, and stragglers are increasing as we get to the Emmitsburg Road. I know some people don't like to talk about it, but it's happening. Pettigrew's lines are materially shortening as we get closer to the road. There's some debate over how effectively Trimble's guys do in the back line. Of course, some guys said later that Trimble's guys got up to the stone wall too. Others said they didn't really advance beyond the Emmitsburg Road. I'll come back to that. Pettigrew's guys, though I think most people acknowledge, did get across the Emmitsburg Road, at least in some strength, and continued up to Cemetery Ridge. But of course, the bullets are flying at this point. Pettigrew at some point is going to be wounded in the hand. Not a very serious wound, but enough to be debilitating here. And of course, he will be mortally wounded and killed on the march. Colonel James, on the march back to Virginia. Colonel James Marshall, commanding Pettigrew's brigade, is going to be mortally wounded somewhere here near the Emmitsburg Road behind me. Now, Marshall, we talked about him in Volume 1, but he's relevant again today.
Yeah, absolutely.
24-year-old VMI graduate coming from a great Virginia bloodline, great orator, great scholar. Thought he was going to have a bright future ahead of him, but somewhere here, leading his men in action near the Emmitsburg Road, he turns to a colleague next to him and says, "We do not know which of us will be the next one to fall," when a bullet comes crashing into his skull and kills him. Marshall killed on the battlefield. His grave was never identified afterwards. Let's talk a little bit about Trimble, though, with the time that we have left. Trimble describes his march, and if I could, I just want to read that a little bit.
Yeah.
Quote, should I do it in my Isaac Trimble voice?
Do it in your Isaac Trimble.
No, I didn't. We marched 3/4 of a mile under a terrible fire, past the first line and reached a point some 200 yards from the breastworks. Here the men broke down from exhaustion, the fatal fire, and we went no further, but walked sullenly back to the entrenchments. It was a mistake to charge batteries and lines over so great a distance, exposed every yard to a hot fire. Now, he later elaborated that when he reached the Emmitsburg Road, men in squads were falling back. By this I inferred that Pickett's division had been repulsed, and if so, that it would be a useless sacrifice of life to continue the contest. I therefore did not attempt to rally the men who began to give back from the fence. And again, there were a lot of allegations later. Who let who down? Did Pettigrew not support Pickett? Did Trimble not support Pettigrew? All kind of part of the after story there. But Trimble was seriously wounded in the leg. His horse Ginny was also killed, and he said he grieved to part with Ginny. But Trimble would have been left behind when the Army of Northern Virginia retreated from Gettysburg.
Yep.
Treated at several field hospitals here, including the Lutheran Seminary, where Trimble complained about a guard who seemed to vex him at every opportunity, and the guards and the nurses in turn complained about Trimble's audacity, which seemed to try their patience. So I think the moral of the story is Trimble was probably not a great patient, but doing what he did, thrown into action here at the last minute on July 3rd, I think he did the best he could.
And he's got, the great thing about Trimble is we actually have now, it's his diary reported. It looks like there's been additions to it later on, but it was published in Maryland Magazine. You probably can get it online, I'm not sure, but you might be able to get that online. But he talks about his horse, Jim. He's up here, he's mounted, his noble horse, Jenny, getting shot in the leg and then carried off the battlefield. But Trimble complained about the food. It's really interesting to read about all that. They sent him down to, like Fort McGovern, they sent him down to Baltimore or something, and he's down there, and the people aren't happy with him down there.
I got to think when they left him behind, General Ewell was probably happy that Trimble got left behind. I'm just thinking.
Yeah. So, but, those troops, I can't imagine, all kidding aside, I can't imagine the infantry fire. We also should say where Abby's filming right here, the Emmitsburg Road diverges away from Cemetery Ridge. So when you're up here on the northern part of the assault, you're actually closer to the Union line than you are down in Pickett's front. So you might be a couple hundred yards in Pickett's front. Here, you're like 100 yards or so in that line. So the intensity of that rifle fire, there's also a battery of artillery, and we're going to save a lot of this, folks. You stay tuned for Volume 3 when we do the Union defense. The 8th Ohio is right over here, over the left of this view, and we're going to cover that, but we're going to cover it in a different video.
We're not ignoring the Yankees. We know the Yankees had a lot to do with this. It's just so important. We're going to give them their whole video.
Right. We want to make sure we cover that separately. Now, right on the other side of where we're standing, on the other side of the Emmitsburg Road, was a small tenant house owned by Abraham Bryan. And when the troops for Pettigrew and Trimble's division got up to it, the Adjutant General of Joe Davis's brigade, a man named William T. Magruder. Magruder was from Maryland. He's born in 1825, so he's 38 years old here in the Battle of Gettysburg. He is mortally wounded right along the Emmitsburg Road, and there is a painting of this by an artist named Frankenstein. He actually shows the little tenant house and what it looked like. It would have been right up against the Emmitsburg Road here, and so we'll cut that in so everybody can see it. But Magruder has a fascinating history. He goes to West Point. He graduates in 1850. He gets put out on to the plains and out in the Southwest, and then he's on the peninsula as a Union officer, and he changes sides, but he doesn't change sides until October of 1862. He's like the last West Point graduate to change sides. He's a Union captain on the peninsula, and William Thomas Magruder is a Confederate captain in Joe Davis's brigade here in the Battle of Gettysburg, and he gets mortally wounded right on along the road. He crawls up against this tenant house of Abraham Bryan. And we have a letter from a guy named Nunn, and Nunn was an officer in the 11th Mississippi, which is the regiment we're following, and Nunn was wounded right next to him. So it says, "My dear madam," this is a letter written July 9 to Mrs. Magruder down in Baltimore, Maryland, William Thomas Magruder's wife. "My dear madam, I regret that it is my painful duty to announce the death of your noble husband, Captain W.T. Magruder, AAG, that's Assistant Adjutant General, of Joe Davis's, to General Davis. He fell on the evening of the 3rd, pierced through the right shoulder. I was seriously wounded in a few moments afterwards and crawled to his side. I knew him well and loved him for his many noble qualities, and he was loved by all the soldiers of his brigade. His last words were to you." Now, he also has in his diary, the last entry in his diary is July 3rd, 1863, and he turns over his belongings to Nunn, but Nunn dies in the field hospital. These belongings do not go back to Mrs. Magruder. Mrs. Magruder particularly wants a watch. Now, she gets some of his items back, apparently, but she puts a reward notice in the local newspaper, and this watch is eventually, we don't know how she got it, but it's eventually returned to her, the original watch that Magruder had here in Pickett's charge that she gets. Now, that body, of course, Magruder dying in field hospital gets in an unknown grave. As far as I know, it doesn't really have a marked grave, but he'll be mortally wounded right over here along adjacent to the road, right now, you know, basically with the 11th Mississippi, which we're following here, Jim. So we're going to move up and we're going to cover the ground now between here and up to the barn. Abby will let you keep going, and we're going to walk across here. So kids, just keep in mind, off to the left, the Union Army is raking fire into this line as we move forward. So let's take a look here, Jim. Okay. So the 11th Mississippi, we've got a great account of William C. Peel. Peel was a member of Company C of the 11th Mississippi, and he's right here. So let's turn this around. We're on the pathway right here. He's right over here in this grass where the view is. If you look closely on the other side of the barn, you will see a monument up against that stone wall. That's a small memorial, the advance marker of the 11th Mississippi that was put here when they dedicated the main marker where we started. So we started where the 11th Mississippi started this attack on July 3rd, and we're basically ending it here for July 3rd. Peel is right out here in front of us. Now, you just ran this gauntlet in Union fire. You got everybody off to the left of this view firing into you, and the only protection you got basically is this end of the barn. Now, you got the Union Army on the other side of the Bryan barn. So the distance of that barn only being a few feet, you got the Union Army on the east side of it, and you got the Confederate Army basically on the west side of it.
Hayes's division, many of the same regiments we saw at the Bliss Farm. Skirmishers at the main bodies are back at the wall behind us.
Now, here's what Peel says. "Thinking the line of battle rather long coming up, I looked to the rear. The state of my feelings may be imagined, but not described. Upon seeing the line broken and fleeing in disorder at the distance of about 150 yards from us, what was to be done?" Now, this is that second line coming up, and the troops that you just described, that Trimble mentioned, are moving off into the rear. Why? Because they're being hit by all this fire that's over here on the left-hand side of this line. I, being the senior in responsibility, if needed there were any, it developed on me. That's the decision here, to do something with his troops right up here in the middle of this. There were two alternatives: become a flying target of 1,000 muskets, or to surrender or become a flying target to 1,000 muskets. We preferred the former, and so they actually moved from right here up against the barn. Then when they're right around the barn, they rush toward the west side of this barn. They're actually right on it. Then he says, that's there, we preferred the former. That means to surrender. Now, because if they try to leave this, they're going to get hit with all the infantry fire. And in a moment, a white flag floated from behind the corner around which the moment before our accurately aimed musket fire had belched their deadly contents into the ranks of the enemy. An old sergeant came out and took charge of us, and we were ordered us through the gate on the left side of the barn. Let's walk. That's this gate right here. So you're standing right where they are. So let's go up to finish right up here, because this is where it is. As Jim mentioned, this is all Alexander Hayes' division for the 2nd Union Army Corps. Here's the house, all redone. The barn, of course, which is original. And that gate stood right here. This, what we just walked up, would have been the little lane area down to the tenant house, right, where Magruder was mortally wounded. As we passed through the gate, that's right here, we passed through all, a Yankee soldier brought down his musket in muzzle right at the breast of one of our party and was on a firing point. I cringed for his safety, but my brave comrade, and shuddered at the thought of seeing him butchered. But at that critical juncture, our sergeant sprang forward and knocked up the musket, and with the word of reproach asked the soldier if he did not see that we had surrendered. So when they walk through this gate, some of the Union soldiers don't realize these men have already surrendered right behind where this barn is. And so somebody comes out here and was going to bayonet them, but this sergeant, who's the Union sergeant, stops that, keeps that from happening. At the same time, further to the north, further to the south of where we're at, Pickett's men have broken through. Armstead is mortally wounded, see Volume 1, and that brings that part of the attack to a halt. Here, Trimble's men getting on the road, retiring. Pettigrew's men that are here, if they're close enough, they're surrendering. If not, they are shot down, basically where they're at. So Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, and a couple accounts actually talk about suffering as many or more casualties as they retreat.
Right, trying to get out of here.
Right, so we get people on the field who like to think of this as a gentlemanly, brotherly war. Several accounts talk about the bullets keep flying as these guys retreat, and I think even Longstreet says in his report, as many or more casualties suffered going back is coming up. So think about that too.
The 11th Mississippi had many color bearers, many. Yeah. We started with William O'Brien, the color bearer, Company C. He's who's on the memorial. Many color bearers carrying that flag. The flag of the 11th Mississippi is today in the American Civil War Museum down in Richmond, Virginia. It still exists. It got right here behind where the barn is after it had been hit by shell fire. It's kind of taken off, and it actually gets surrendered, and it's still around here today, being carried across this field for July 3rd, 1863. So as we're here, we're at the far left, the end of this attack for the third day's battle. Obviously, this is a failure for the Confederates, and they're going to retreat back, try to take up a defensive position, and meanwhile, Meade is going to wait here. He's not going to attack the next day, and then you have the retreat on July 4th and 5th. But we want everybody to come back and see us, because eventually we're going to do this Union defense, Jim, and we're going to talk about the units that are here, the ones that are for Hayes' division taking out the 11th Mississippi. Suffice to say, our walk today, Pettigrew and Trimble, Volume 2 of Pickett's charge.
Right. Probably 3,000 casualties suffered by Pettigrew and Trimble today. Again, casualties are not broken down by day. That's an estimate. Clearly significant. And as we all know, a spectacular failure for the Army of Northern Virginia, a victory for the Army of the Potomac. But as Wayne alluded to at the outset of the video, Robert E. Lee, when talking about failure, why did it not succeed?
Right.
You know, there's that great quote, supposedly Lee meets with John M. Bowdoin that night and says, you know, I don't know why Pickett's division was not supported the way they should. Oh, too bad, too bad. And that set off, 160 years of wondering who was Lee talking about. Longstreet in his report, it should be added, sort of blamed Pettigrew and Trimble for falling back and not supporting Pickett's division the way he envisioned. So you want to look to Longstreet for some of that criticism too. But Robert E. Lee, twice in his report, July 1863, January 1864, on two occasions said he thought it was the failure of his artillery which caused his troops to get into the entrenchments of the enemy, but were unable to hold their positions. So if you want to look to what Robert E. Lee put in writing, he said artillery twice.
Yeah, it's not Wayne Motts and Jim Hessler.
Right.
This is what Robert, and we said that multiple times. This is what Robert E. Lee said.
Because people get very upset with this on the roundtable circuit, but that's what Robert E. Lee said.
Yeah, and why does Brockenbrough withdraw and he's not taking that many casualties? Because it's under this concentrated fire. So all you got to do to look to that is just look to what it caused here on July 2nd. That artillery, and Lee puts in his report, the left of the column was already wavering, or the left attack was already wavering. Those are the words he actually uses that are here.
Yeah, he does.
I tell you, we want to thank Abby behind the camera for the Gettysburg Foundation. Jim, I can't thank you enough. What a wonderful, wonderful day we've had walking Pettigrew and Trimble's charge, Pickett's charge, Volume 2 here, and we're extremely happy you can come out with us, spend your time volunteering for us today, spending your time to be out here to help the Gettysburg Foundation. I also want to give a shout out to the National Park Service. Remember, this house was altered. Park Service, they've done a great job in trying to rehabilitate these buildings, get them back to where they were on the battlefield. The Gettysburg Foundation, their partner, helping them do that. There's 6,000 acres of property around here, folks, and it's a lot. It's a lot to take care of. So we're grateful under the park stewardship we're able to walk this. When I first came down here as a kid, power lines all down the Emmitsburg Road. One of the first projects the Friends of the National Parks of Gettysburg did long ago, 30 years ago, bury these power lines. So you can help us by going to these videos, being sure to watch them, subscribe to stuff on social media, watch everything we're doing, and join the foundation. Be part of the soldiers who help preserve this battlefield. You're going to get my commercial, Jim, but you can help us out there by becoming a member, donating it to foundation. Go over to the website and do that, because it's just great stuff. So we're grateful, and we appreciate everyone's time today, and we look forward to seeing you for another Walking Wednesday. And we had a great time for Pickett's Charge Volume 2, Pettigrew and Trimble.